Good evening, and thank you for joining us. My name is Dr. Brian Henning. I am Professor of Philosophy and Environmental Studies and Sciences here at Gonzaga University, where I have the pleasure of directing the Gonzaga Institute for Climate, Water, and the Environment. It's my great pleasure to be with you again tonight for the latest installment of our For Our Common Home lecture series. Just to alert you to a couple of events that are still coming up this semester. Our next is on April 15th. We'll be hosting Anna Johnson. We'll be talking about fossil fuel divestment. That event will be both in person in the Hemmingsen Center and streaming online. And then to round us out for this academic year, I'll be giving a talk on April 22nd, Earth Day. That is the 4th anniversary of the founding of the Climate Institute. And I'll be delivering a lecture discussing what it is to graduate in the age of Trump. As always, you can go to gonzaga.edu/climate events and register for those events. And of course, there's a wonderful library of past events. If you go to our YouTube channel, go to youtube.com/@Gonzaga Climate and find all of our past events. As you might imagine, hosting these events and doing the work that we do in the Inland Northwest takes considerable resources. And if you find yourself in a position to be able to help us, we would really sincerely appreciate it. As the federal government continually moves away from supporting climate action and the climate crisis continues to become more severe with each passing day, it's important that community members who have the means share some of those to help us to expand and continue our work so that we can make it through this administration and to the next to be able to continue all the important work. Lives are literally at stake. So please do consider supporting us if you are able to do so. And with that, it is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker for tonight. I was really interested ever since we found an increase in load caused initially by Bitcoin mining, and then later the expanded increase of AI is causing so much need for energy demand that a number of corporations are beginning to look for novel ways of creating enough electricity to be able to meet the quickly increasing demand. And so one of the ways that they're doing that is by pursuing renewed nuclear energy, either traditional nuclear power plants or small modular nuclear reactors. And so when I found the work of Dr. Lyman, I was really excited to be able to invite him to talk a little bit about this new technology and whether or not, in fact, it is should be central in our attempts to both address our energy needs while meeting the increasing needs for energy production at the same time. So our speaker is Dr. Edwin Lyman. He's the Director of Nuclear Power Safety at the Union of Concerned Scientists in Washington, D.C. He earned a doctorate in physics from Cornell and is co-author with David Lochbaum and Susan Stranahan of the book Fukushima, The Story of a Nuclear Disaster, published in 2014. He's the recipient of the 2018 Leo Lazard Leadership Award from the American Physical Society. And from 2020 to 2022, he served on a National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine study on advanced nuclear fuel cycles. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Edwin Lyman.
Thank you, Professor Henning. Should I share my screen now?
Absolutely. Thank you. Coming in nicely in audio.
Okay. All right. Are we in business?
Looks good. All set.
Great. Well, okay. Right. So good afternoon, Spokane. I'm sorry I'm not there in person to talk to you today about this issue, which is small modular nuclear reactors, otherwise known as SMRs. Today, I'm hoping to shed a little light on what you may have been hearing or not hearing about the prospects for new nuclear power in the United States. So a little bit about the organization I work for, Union of Concerned Scientists. Historically, we've been a nuclear safety and security watchdog for over 50 years. Originally, one of the issues that this nonprofit pursued when it was first founded was nuclear power safety. And even though it has grown and expanded the range of topics that to encompass a wide range of environmental and public health issues, nuclear power safety is still part of our core mission. And over that time, we've been studiously neither pro nor anti-nuclear. We don't take a position for or against. We think that would be kind of counterproductive and close doors. But we do strongly believe that nuclear power has to be safe and secure if it is going to be deployed in the United States and around the world. And the problem is the issue's been so polarized, and the political and power dynamics around energy and nuclear power in particular are so overwhelming that it's really hard to get a straight story, first of all, from the industry about its safety record. But it's also, and it's hard for the public to assert themselves when they want to ensure that nuclear power is operated safely. And so in that context, it's quite a challenge to ensure that this inherently dangerous technology is actually deployed and operated safely. And nuclear power is actually stagnated around the world. For many decades, the total share of electricity generation from nuclear power hasn't changed very much. After a burst of enthusiasm in the 1960s and to the 1980s. But in recent years, there has been a resurgence of interest among a lot of different groups, in particular, uh, people who are or stakeholders who are concerned about climate change have recognized that nuclear power is a low carbon source of electricity, at least when reactors operate to generate electricity. They don't emit carbon like fossil fuel plants do. And so that is a benefit. Um, and in only in as Professor Henning mentioned, only in the last few years has the potential for greatly increased electricity demand here in the United States become a possibility because of the energy demands from data centers to power artificial intelligence models, as well as, unfortunately, Bitcoin mining has came up. We can talk about that separately. So the issue of whether that demand is really justified, first of all, and whether it's going to be realized, or are there going to be more efficient ways to operate those data centers and run AI models still remains to be seen. But right now, there's a lot of enthusiasm and a lot of expectation that there'll be a greatly increased demand. And nuclear power in some quarters has been seen as a way to help meet that demand. But and in the context of the last um, uh, few decades, the industry has tried to rebrand nuclear power as clean energy. And certainly, as I said, nuclear power doesn't generate carbon when the reactors are operating, but that doesn't mean that clean is necessarily a good way to describe it, because it does have uh, several serious disadvantages compared to other low carbon sources of electricity generation like wind and solar. First and foremost is nuclear safety. And the fact that nuclear power plants are it's an exacting technology, and it requires great care in construction operation, and a slip up, a failure of multiple safety systems can lead to a serious accident and the release of large quantities of radioactive material into the environment, as the world most recently saw during the Fukushima disaster in 2011, when three nuclear reactors in Japan flooded as a result of a tsunami and melted down, creating a huge radioactive mess in East Asia that is going to take many decades and many hundreds of billions of dollars to clean up. Then there's the issue of security. And no matter how safe a nuclear plant may look on paper, if you look at all the, how its safety systems respond to an accident, you also have to worry about protecting it from malevolent actors. And that could either be the potential for domestic or international terrorists to sabotage a nuclear plant, or as the world saw with the Russian takeover of the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant in Ukraine in 2022, a, a nuclear plant that one day is in a peaceful state, the next day could be the object of a military attack and suddenly in the middle of a war zone, as Zaporizhia has been for the last several years, with shelling going on a daily basis in its vicinity. So you have to be concerned now about the fact that a nuclear power plant, is a 50 or an 80 or 100-year investment, and the world changes over that. Then there's the ever-present threat of nuclear proliferation and the fact that the same materials and facilities that are used for generating peaceful nuclear power can be misused in the wrong hands to produce materials for nuclear weapons. And that requires an exacting international regime to be able to deter the misuse of peaceful nuclear facilities, but that regime doesn't always work very well, as the world's seen with North Korea and possibly Iran in recent decades. And nuclear power does generate radioactive waste. These wastes have components in them that are very long-lived and hazardous to the environment, and analyses generally show that you do need to make sure that they are contained for hundreds of thousands of years, or they could cause unacceptable contamination in the environment. And that is another major challenge. And finally, possibly the biggest obstacle to nuclear power deployment is the fact that it's expensive. It's expensive to build nuclear plants. It's generally expensive to operate them. And that has been a deterrent in many places when lower cost sources of power exist, not only fossil fuels, but also increasingly wind and solar. Now, the workhorse of nuclear power today in the US and around the world, in nearly all countries, is the light water reactor. And this is a type of nuclear reactor that is cooled by ordinary water. And the reactors have grown over the decades, and the typical large light water reactor is on the order of 1,000 megawatts of electricity in capacity. And something else to note about light water reactors is that they use what's called low enriched uranium as fuel. In particular, the enrichment is less than 5% in the isotope uranium-235, and I'll be talking more about that later. But what's important to note is that this fuel is not directly usable in nuclear weapons. So if it were stolen or diverted by malevolent actors, they would need to have access to a complicated and expensive and highly controlled technology called uranium enrichment. So today's light water reactors have a level of proliferation resistance in their fresh fuel, in that if it's stolen, you have to do something else to it to be able to use it in a nuclear weapon. Now, in most countries around the world, other than China, very few of these large light water reactors, or in fact, any nuclear plants, have been built in recent decades. As I pointed out, cost and the time it takes to build have been inhibiting factors. And as a result, there's been, again, a stagnation of total nuclear capacity, which is only slowly turning around over the last couple of years. And some nuclear advocates think that the large light water reactor is the problem. And they think of them as behemoths, dinosaurs, no utility, is going to want to build a large nuclear plant like that. It's very inflexible. And so the idea that smaller nuclear plants that could possibly be built more quickly, that are cheaper and can be constructed and deployed, matching or in a better match to changes in demand, will make nuclear power more flexible and affordable and usable, and therefore will help boost nuclear power around the world. And so a lot of things are being said about SMRs, a lot of hope, again, that the claim is that ultimately they'll be more economical and quicker to build. Also that they'll be able to provide reliable power right out of the gate for things like data centers. There's claims that these reactors are passively safe, unlike today's large light water reactors, although there are large light water reactors, new ones that have passive safety features, but it's easier to have passive safety for a smaller reactor than a larger one. That's certainly true. And when I say passive safety, I mean that you are relying primarily on natural forces to provide coolant in the event of an accident, rather than having to have pumps that require electricity to operate to force water through the radioactive cores. So that's one of the main characteristics of what's called passive safety. Also, because a smaller reactor has less radioactive material in it, if something bad happens, there's less material to be dispersed. And again, that's true on its face, but there are some important caveats that I don't talk about. Some people even say that these reactors will produce proportionally less nuclear waste, or even be able to recycle their own waste, and therefore they're going to be able to reduce or solve the nuclear waste problem that I talked about. And again, you have to take this with a huge grain of salt. And also, it's claimed that these reactors are more efficient. And this whole list, these are all, either misleading or leaving a lot out, or they're outright false. But unfortunately, these misleading claims are dominating the public debate. And as a result, I feel like they've distorted the ability of the public to make independent judgments based on good science about what they're being told about nuclear power, not just the public, but also policymakers, investors, and the like, and that this is not going to lead to the best outcome if this industry builds itself up based on misleading information and that does not lead to the outcome that they're telling people to expect. Now, there are a whole range of different types of SMRs. As I said, or an SMR, strictly speaking, is defined as a nuclear reactor that's less than 300 megawatts of electrical capacity, compared to, again, about 1,000 for the current large light water reactors. And the M in SMR is modular. And the idea is that if you have these smaller reactors and you deploy them more widely, if you had a centralized manufacturing facility and you were able to learn how to make them better as you make more of them, that you're going to get efficiencies in modular construction, again, that can be deployed in a modular fashion. And so, but outside of that general description, there's a whole menagerie of different types of reactors. One are based on light water reactor technology. They're evolutionary variants, but have certain significant differences, but they still run on ordinary water and the same types of fuel that large light water reactors use. And one company was founded originally in Oregon State University, is called NuScale. And these are 77 megawatt electric units, at least the current design. And right now, NuScale's only live prospect is to build a reactor in Romania. And I'm putting question marks here because, as far as I know, none of these projects have enough, or many of them do not have, it's not clear that they have the financing to actually go forward. General Electric Hitachi, and General Electric is an established company, of course, that has had a long history in nuclear power development, and they've developed their own SMR at 300 megawatts, and there's now plans to possibly deploy them in Ontario or the state of Tennessee. Then a totally different type of reactor is the liquid sodium-cooled fast reactor. And this is actually a design which dates back as long as the light water reactor design. They were both conceived about the same time, back in the late 1940s. But for many reasons, these reactors were not widely deployed, even though countries around the world were determined to try to develop them for decades. But the light water reactor won out, and I think there are good reasons for that. But there are hopes and dreams that this type of reactor will eventually catch on again. And currently, there is a construction permit for a sodium-cooled fast reactor called the Natrium that has been the company called TerraPower, which was founded by Bill Gates and is still the single largest investor, I think, has applied for a construction permit with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to build a Natrium in Kemmerer, Wyoming. And that would be technically a little bit larger than an SMR at 345 megawatts. Then there's a whole other class of reactors, which are called high temperature gas cooled reactors. Again, a very old technology, but one that's been resurrected. And most recently, Amazon has declared its interest in investing in a company called X Energy. Got all those. X Energy is developing a type of gas-cooled reactor, and these are reactors that are, as the title would give away, are cooled by high-pressure gas. The first X-Energy plant is supposed to be built in Seadrift, Texas, at a Dow Chemical facility there, but the company has also declared its intention to partner with Energy Northwest to build up to 12 of these X-Energy units at the Hanford site in Washington near the Columbia Generating Station. So this is the one that might be of most interest to folks in your region. Then there are even more exotic types of reactors. There are molten salt cooled reactors, which have gotten a boost from Google. Then there are even molten salt fueled reactors. These are reactors where the fuel is not a solid, as it is in all the other types of reactors I've talked about, but the fuel itself is actually a liquid. And right now, there's a small test reactor that has a construction permit from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission at Abilene Christian University in Abilene, Texas, to build a fueled reactor. And then there's a whole class of reactors that are even smaller, which are called microreactors. And these are generally less than 20 megawatts and could go all the way down to 1 megawatt of electricity. And for some reason, this has captured the imagination of a lot of people, the idea that somehow you could have a nuclear reactor, essentially the size of an emergency diesel or backup diesel generator, that might be as flexible in operation as a diesel generator is. And there's a whole lot of microreactor companies that have sprung up. But again, in many of these cases, the demand is not really there, except for very specialized applications. Yet, for some reason, there's a lot of talk and interest about these microreactors. And this has some of the designs I just talked about, some of the companies, but there are many others in this space. But despite all the talk, as far as I can tell, even though many of the tech companies that I've talked about and data center operators have signed memorandum of understanding with reactor vendors most of these are non-binding agreements with no real upfront investment. The only exception to that, I think, was the Amazon deal with X Energy, where they contributed part of a financing round up to $500 million. But as far as I can tell, these other tech companies are not actually buying, or they're not ordering nuclear reactors and funding their construction yet. So it remains to be seen how viable these projects are. The only projects that are actually advancing today to licensing construction are those that are heavily subsidized by the US government, that is us, taxpayers. And there are a whole lot of logistical issues. So there are a lot of different ways you could deploy small modular reactors and micro reactors. You could build them at existing utility sites and connect them to the existing grid, or you could co-locate them at the centers of demand like data centers and have them behind the meter. And in particular, that second option, which seems to be attracting a lot of interest, raises a lot of safety and security issues, which we'll talk about. But it's also important to understand that most of these new designs are technologies that, although they're not really new, they've not been fully developed or commercially deployed. And to take something which is from a design, on paper, to actually reliable deployment, that is something that you can count on to operate without shutting down every few hours, is likely to take decades and many billions of dollars. And the data center operators don't seem to have the patience for that. So there's a real pressure to rush the process of new technology development, deployment, and construction. And I think that's where the problems really lie. And these are just some illustrations of the projects that taxpayers are subsidizing, both Bill Gates' Natrium reactor and the X-Energy facility in Texas are getting 50% cost share up to about $3 billion. If the costs go beyond that, and actually they're already projected to possibly be double or triple the original estimate, it's not clear if Congress is going to keep funding those. So that remains to be seen. But if you just look at those companies that are funded only by private, or the contribution from private capital, that is private equity or venture capital. Here's something, a graph from S&P Global last month. And it looks like the amount of private investment in advanced nuclear has really grown in 2024. But if you actually look at how that number is divided up, 500 million is that investment in X-Energy I was talking about. So that's one single company that's gotten that. The second on this list is actually a nuclear fusion startup, and that's a whole other topic of conversation. But let it be said that I think any nuclear fusion prospects for energy, electricity production in the near or in the foreseeable future are even less viable than many of these fission reactor projects. And so, the actual numbers aren't that impressive in terms of the overall industry. So I still think private capital is slow to jump on this bandwagon yet. And one of the main reasons why is that because of the principle of economies of scale, small modular reactors are going to start off with a major cost disadvantage compared to larger reactors. And that's because generally economies of scale dictates that a facility will produce a product at a lower unit cost as the facility gets bigger. You go in the other direction, you might end up reversing that. And just based on basic principles, if you shrink down a 1,000-megawatt plant to a identical sized miniature at 77 megawatts, then that could mean the unit cost of electricity would be nearly 5 times greater. Now, of course, that's not the plan. The plan is to do things differently. And so to compensate for this cost penalty, the SMR advocates are claiming that there'll be a lot of other ways to cut costs. I already talked about the mass production and learning, but most studies don't show that you can get anywhere near a reduction cost from learning that could compensate for that economies of scale penalty. And moreover, with that large diversity of companies that we just saw on a previous screen, the likelihood that any one of those is going to get enough market share to be able to dominate the industry and produce hundreds or thousands of units and benefit from standardization, it looks low. It looks like the industry is really scattered right now, and that's the opposite of standardization. And so it doesn't look like the stars are aligning to realize this kind of model. And this is why the investment community is still skeptical. And here's uh, JP Morgan, chairman of market investment strategy, just earlier this month, who calls them lottery tickets and expressed his own skepticism. So there you have it. But the problem is, because of this intense cost pressure from reducing the size of reactors, they have to be offset somehow. And this is pushing SMR developers to try to cut costs in a lot of different ways. For instance, they want to be able to be more flexible in where you put reactors. And uh, uh, so there's actually proposals, or there are ways in which they could justify locating small reactors closer to densely populated urban areas, even though that was discouraged by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission for many decades. They also, every single one, does not intend to have the same kind of physical containment structure that the large light water reactors have. And the containment is generally a reinforced concrete structure that's lined with steel and essentially is leak tight. And this is meant to contain radioactive material in the event that there is an accident that causes a core melt. And many of these new reactors couldn't afford to have that kind of a structure because it's expensive. And so they're trying to justify having much weaker containments or none at all. Then there's a move to eliminate off-site radiological emergency planning. Right now, a nuclear reactor owner is required to develop emergency plans for the area 10 miles around each reactor site. And these small reactor operators are claiming that because their reactors are so much safer and there's less radioactive material, et cetera, that you may not need any offsite emergency planning beyond the fence of the plant itself. And uh, I have a lot to say about that. Also, they claim that, again, because the reactors are so safe, you don't need security officers who are going to prevent someone from attacking the plant and sabotaging it. They also claim that the operators don't need to know as much as the current operators of the current fleet because the reactors are getting so safe. And so they're pushing to reduce the number of operators and the level of training they have. And the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, unfortunately, has gone along with most of these proposals. Either they're already implemented in new regulations or they're in process of making these changes. And my concern is that if you look at the cumulative effect of all these changes, even if you had a super safe design, if you take into account all of these other regulatory rollbacks, the net consequence to the public could be as bad or even worse than the current fleet. So that's a problem. And small is not always safer because even if a reactor itself is small, you may have multiple modules in a site, and it depends on how they interact during an accident. Fukushima, you had 6 nuclear reactors, and 3 of them melted down. And part of the problem in trying to rescue some of the reactors on site was because the one next to it was melting down and making it impossible for workers to intervene to save the adjacent site, the adjacent plants. Then, if you have less defense in depth, you have weaker or no containments. If you're located in a densely populated urban area, then the amount of radiation that may reach populated areas could be greater than they are today. And so there are a whole bunch of reasons why just saying reactor is smaller doesn't necessarily mean it's safer. And small reactors are generally not going to produce less waste per unit of electricity generated than large reactors. That's also misleading. Um, just taking a look at a sodium cooled fast reactor, again, like the Natrium reactor that Bill Gates wants to build in Wyoming, just to show that these reactors are not passively safe. This is a calculation that was done by San Diego National Laboratories. And just looking at what happens if a single fuel assembly, if the coolant flow to a single fuel assembly in a fast reactor is blocked. This technical slide, but you should note that the time scale that in a matter of seconds, the temperature of that fuel assembly is going to double or more and reach the temperature at which it fails. So these reactors are actually inherently unstable in my view, not passively safe. And unfortunately, the marketing for the reactor is, including Mr. Gates himself, is putting forth misleading information about its safety, which I'm concerned about. And again, I talked about sabotage. No matter how safe a reactor is, as far as its resistance to accidents, sabotage could cause a serious event. One event in particular that I'm worried about is if there's someone in the control room, an insider or an adversary that takes it over, they can override the systems that keep the reactor power steady and potentially cause a large power excursion, sort of like what the world saw during the Chernobyl accident in 1986, which caused the reactor to explode. And we have some evidence that you can do that to a small reactor. In the United States in the 1960s, they actually had a program where they blew up nuclear reactors in the middle of the Nevada desert, at the Nevada test site, as part of an effort to develop a space reactor program, nuclear rocket engines. One of those tests was called Kiwi TNT, and this started out with it was about let's say 300, the equivalent of about a 300 megawatt electric reactor, so about sort of the biggest SMRs that are being planned. But by manipulating the safety systems for this reactor, they were able to cause it to explode. And this is what it looked like. And even though the reactor itself didn't have any radioactivity initially in the core, during the increase in power, there was some radioactive material generated, and that dispersed pretty widely as far away as Los Angeles. A plume was detected. And if there were actually radioactive material at the time of the explosion, it could have been much worse. So it's not a theoretical possibility that these reactors could be sabotaged to blow up and spread radiation around a wide area. And there's the issue of the waste. The U.S. currently has no program, to develop a deep geologic repository for the spent nuclear fuel that's already been generated. And so the prospect that new reactors are going to have a place where their spent fuel can be sent after these reactors are used up is non-existent. Now, not only is there no plan for a deep geologic repository to be developed anymore, but there are no plans for a consolidated interim storage site. And such a site would be able to would be a place for existing nuclear reactors to send their spent fuel off-site at least. That's not a replacement for a deep geologic repository. It doesn't even help on a national basis, but it could be a way to help individual operators from having to manage that fuel forever. But right now, in a court a case that was just argued by the Supreme in front of the Supreme Court a few weeks ago, Texas v. NRC, there's a challenge to whether the NRC has the authority to license such a facility at all. And if, depending on how that goes, there may never be an opportunity for an away from reactor license storage site. So that means any community accepting new reactors really have to be prepared to become a de facto permanent storage site for its nuclear waste. And just to illustrate this, is a presentation I watched today, sponsored by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, looking at uh, uh, the analysis of one of these microreactors I was talking about. And so the analysis looked at the safety aspects of the entire fuel cycle of this reactor, from the production of the fuel, the transport of the fuel, the react or the fabrication of the fuel, the transport to reactor site, and then on-site storage after the reactor is used up, which could be as little as 7 years. And there's no module T3 in this, and T stands for transportation. And that's because, as it was explained, there's no information about where that fuel would go after the reactor is no longer usable. And I think that's telling there no one knows. So that means these communities are going to be stuck with that fuel possibly forever, and they have to accept that possibility. I got a lot more here as usual. I'm running behind, but I do want to just mention that, again, many of these reactor types would use different types of fuel than the low enriched uranium that light water reactors use. For instance, many or most of the non-light water reactors would use a fuel called HALEU. That's high assay low enriched uranium. And this is uranium where the uranium-235 content is enriched to above 10% or near 20%, which is not currently what's used in light water reactors. In fact, it's not even really commercially available in any kind of large quantities other than from Russia. And at the moment, importing enriched uranium and that kind of is discouraged and will eventually be banned according to a law that was passed in Congress last year. So that means that the fuel is going to, this HALEU is going to have to be produced here in the United States. And one thing to know about HALEU is that even though it's less attractive for nuclear weapons use than the most highly enriched uranium, which is called HEU, which is above 20%, I believe it's still directly usable in bombs if you have enough of it. And unfortunately, the reactors that are going to be using HALEU, including the TerraPower Natrium, X-Energy, and a whole bunch of others, are going to need many tons of this stuff per year. Now, right now, the US doesn't have the capability to manufacture that much HALEU. In fact, the only current production of HALEU is at a demonstration plant in Ohio owned by a company called Centrus. And they were already well behind what they had promised the Department of Energy they could produce. They're only operating about half the rate of the original goal, and they've only made about 500 kilograms of HALEU to date after working for several years. And in the context of a reactor that's going to need many tons just for its initial core, you can see that this is not going to be adequate. But eventually, the U.S. Department of Energy is putting billions of dollars into shoring up or developing an industry to produce HALEU in this country. The problem is, as I alluded to, is that I believe that HALEU can be used in nuclear weapons. Last year, I co-authored a study in Science magazine that argued that if you have enough of it and it was stolen, it could be used in a crude nuclear weapon. And the problem is that the standards for protecting this material don't currently assume that it could be used directly in a nuclear weapon. Therefore, I think they're inadequate. And if we see a generation of new small modular reactors around the country, around the world, that would require many tons worth of this material, that could be a major proliferation security threat. And I think I'll stop there, but I want to point out I published a report called Advanced Isn't Always Better in 2021. You can find it on the UCS website, where I look at a number of these issues that I talked about and ranked different reactor designs according to the properties like safety and non-proliferation. And so there were a lot of details about what I just talked about in that report. And so finally, I would say, what we're seeing now is there's a competition. There are a lot of small vendors that have entered the space trying to sell or develop new nuclear reactors. They're all vying for media attention and public and private financing. And that, I believe, is creating a very unrealistic, it's creating a bubble of inflated claims and a lot of goals that can't be met. And that's not likely to end well. And if you don't learn the lessons of the past about how, successful nuclear power projects and how they were developed and deployed, then you're not going to be able to safely and securely expand nuclear power around the world. So I think I'll stop there and take your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lyman. Appreciate that. If you want, you can. Oh, there you got it. Very good. Well, thank you so much for sharing all of that. There's a lot there, and I want to encourage everybody who has questions to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom window to pose a question there. We've got a few coming in that I'm going to pose, but give people a second to collect their thoughts. I was hoping to start off with something that you mentioned a couple of times, which is having to do with subsidies. Are the subsidies for nuclear power relative to the amount of energy produced? Do you have a sort of a ratio? Since pretty much every form of energy is subsidized to some degree, so that we can't say, oh, that by itself is automatically a disqualifier. What's the ratio difference between, let's say, coal, gas, nuclear, and wind, solar? I mean, that's just in general in orders of magnitude. Is it close?
Well, one thing about nuclear power, it depends how you count and where you start. But the whole nuclear power enterprise was, of course, originally started by government funding. The Atomic Energy Commission was the original promoter and developer of nuclear power in this country. And UCS actually put out a study, is probably more than 10 years now, trying to add up all those subsidies. But they do, off the top of my head, they're certainly on the order of probably hundreds of billions over the years, if not trillions. And yeah, and it's true that we don't, nuclear power subsidy is not necessarily a bad word if it's supporting a social good and if it's compensating for, let's say, the market failures like the inability to have to impose an external cost for carbon emissions, for example. But we do think nuclear power has had more than its share of subsidy. It's gotten off the ground. You can't argue it's a new industry that requires a large level of continued government support. And so you wonder at what point should it be cut loose, after 60 or 70 years of large boost from the government. And so I don't know how constructive it is to do comparisons, in the past, other than acknowledging, that it's already had that boost compared to more immature technologies that you can say probably deserve subsidies more. But you still also need to look at moving forward, whether the subsidies are actually going to be getting you the results that society expects from that kind of investment. And then you have to compare the benefit from those investments in nuclear power to other low carbon technologies that don't have the same level of safety and security risk. So,
I guess another way of bringing this in is to move to one of our first questions. This is from Alan, and it's kind of a really central aspect of, I think, evaluating this, and that's sort of bringing in a life cycle analysis view. And so Alan asks, while day-to-day operations of nuclear plants suggest clean full life cycle assessment, I'm sorry, it suggests they're clean. So you said nuclear power is clean by kind of one definition in terms of carbon emissions. But if we take a life cycle analysis of, prior to the plant being constructed, so going all the way back to mining and in building and operating and then decommissioning, would you say that it's even carbon free? Is it appropriate to refer to it as carbon free if we use a life cycle analysis?
yeah, and that's why I was kind of careful to distinguish between the carbon emits or doesn't emit during operation. Certainly, the life cycle does uh, have carbon emissions associated with it. The mining and milling operations, which are out in the field, certainly a lot of fossil fuels and transportation are required for that. Those industrial operations generally are fossil fuel driven. Then enrichment is um, an electricity intensive process, less so now with more advanced enrichment technologies than it was in the past, but still requires electricity. And so overall, yes, there is a contribution from other stages of the fuel cycle. And if you try to look, there have been a number of studies that have tried to quantify that, but they're really all over the map. And to some extent, they depend pretty heavily on, let's say, the grade of the uranium that you're mining, and it's pretty sensitive to that. But generally, mining, milling, and enrichment are the most carbon intensive aspects of the fuel cycle. And one thing I didn't have time to mention was in my presentation is that a lot of these small reactors actually are less efficient in their use of uranium, and that it takes more natural uranium mining to support or to produce a single kilowatt hour of electricity from some of these smaller reactors than it does from large reactors. And therefore, whatever burden, whatever carbon emissions are associated with the mining, milling, and enrichment parts of the fuel cycle, they'll be enhanced for small reactors. Now, it still might not push it up to, let's say, the level of natural gas emissions per kilowatt hour, but it's not, it's less efficient in a lot of different ways, and carbon generation is one of those. So,
And then
so
and then moving beyond just carbon emissions, since you're mentioning mining, if I understood you correctly, it sounds like the SMRs and microreactors could actually require more uranium and therefore more mining. Did I understand that correctly?
that's right, and primarily the ones that are non-light water reactors that would use high assay low enriched uranium. If you look at, and it's on my slides, unfortunately, I don't have time. Some of them, again, would require mining 2 or 3 times as much uranium, again, to produce that kilowatt hour of electricity. So all the environmental impacts associated with mining and all those externalities are enhanced for the small reactors if they use uranium less efficiently. And
That's really interesting. Yeah, I didn't realize that here in our community in Eastern Washington, in the middle of the Spokane tribe, just north of us, is a mine called the Midnight Mine, which is a legacy uranium mine, and it's continuing to create environmental and health burdens for that community permanently. And so, not only do you have the legacy of the pollution at the end, where we have no, you spoke really nicely about the fact that we don't have any plans for what to do with the waste generated, but we also have the legacy of the mining is also something we seem to be able to remediate in any meaningful ways, and those communities then bear that burden in perpetuity. And so at both ends of its birth and death, we have this problem.
yes, that's right. And in theory, more modern mining methods have a smaller environmental impact than legacy mining, but they introduce other like in situ solution mining introduces other issues. So it's not clear, but there's no question that uranium mining has a significant environmental impact that it shouldn't be overlooked in looking at nuclear power's life cycle impacts overall. And again, this going in the direction of these more exotic nuclear plants could relatively proportionally increase that burden.
That's
And
really interesting to note. There's been lots of conversation, and rightly so, about the impact of mining for rare earth metals, for electric vehicle batteries, for example, and people are right to talk about that. I don't hear as much conversation about that in the context of the small modular nuclear reactor. So I appreciate you putting that on our radar. Neil asks, can you speak about the situation with SMRs in China?
yeah, so China, they have a government, sponsored top-down nuclear industries and so many other aspects of their economy. They're trying, letting a thousand flowers bloom, sort of like we're trying to do here, with trying out a number of different technologies. Um, they do have, I think they're the first country to actually start up what's considered a small modular reactor, although it's not really modular because it's a one-off. I don't think they have, again, a mass manufacturing facility, but it's a small reactor. And that did, I believe, start up last year. But again, um, it's hard to make direct comparisons between what China's doing and what other parts of the world are doing because the economy is so different, as well as everything for environmental standards, worker protection, environmental protection, all those are kind of unique. So, but yes, China is certainly moving forward, although more slowly. Everything's always more slow. Everything's always slower than the original plans, even in China. Uh, so, uh, so it doesn't look like that's going to lead to a blossoming of Chinese small modular reactors all over the world. It's still slow getting out the gate.
Both Alan and Gregory ask a similar question that has to do with nuclear submarines. So Alan puts it this way: one of the arguments that SMR proponents use is that we already have SMR powering nuclear submarines built, of course, where cost overruns are not critical. And then Gregory adds on another version of that, says, why can't we get one or two approved standardized designs for reactors in the US so that we can get away from expensive customized designs? I served on a nuclear submarine where the Navy operated many copies of the same design. Everyone in the fleet continued to learn and improve their operations based on ongoing communications and standard designs. That would be cheaper and safer.
Right. Well, to start with right. So a lot of the vendors are promoting that model. They're claiming that, the Navy has provided a path forward for the commercial industry. But, I think historically the way the Navy manages those programs, and again, the issue of cost constraints may not be quite as critical. And again, we don't know that much, in the public about uh, the nuclear navy and those designs. But my suspicion, dating back to the founding of the program and Admiral Rickover, is that they maintain very high safety standards, even when there might be cost considerations that would suggest doing otherwise. And the commercial industry just doesn't have that kind of discipline or funding streams. They operate in much different environments. So it's not clear that model is really is transferable to the civil sphere. And I think one illustration of that is what the other individual mentioned, the fact that there is this multiplicity of designs out there, despite the attempts on the part of the industry and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to encourage standardization. The fact is that there is no top-down, we don't have a central steering committee that's dictating what designs are going to be manufactured. This did happen in France, for example, when they built up their own nuclear fleet. But that's just not the environment the industry is operating in here. And you can see this wide diversity of different designs and the fact that each tech company has latched onto a completely different company, different design. Uh, uh, Unless there was some sort of national strategy to uh, not only encourage but to mandate standardization, it doesn't seem like it's going to happen. Uh, so um, so that those are the issues. Do we want the federal government to pick and choose the one or two designs that should be developed? Probably not. But letting this kind of chaos reign doesn't seem to be supporting the goal of improved learning and centralized manufacturing that a lot of people talk about.
Thank you. Let's go to Mary. She asks, from my understanding, some countries, France in particular, have been relatively successful in generating, using, and exporting nuclear power in the form of electricity. Granted, they may be limited in terms of other fuel input options, but what other factors do you see playing into a nation's or a region's successful execution of nuclear power production apart from necessity?
Well, again, in the example of France, they built up their fleet, again, as sort of a top-down approach with just a couple of standardized designs. Uh, but even France has run into trouble, and actually that points to the flip side of having a standardized design is that if you have a flaw uh, in that design or in the materials or construction, you might end up with a lot of, a much wider headache on your hands. In fact, that did happen in France. As a result of standardization, they had at one point uh, to shut down, I think, a third or more of their reactor fleet at once because of an emerging uh, corrosion issue, which was replicated throughout, the entire model plant. And so again, it's not clear what the right model is to be completely successful. In fact, France, which had been not a big expert in the European electricity market, but they went from a net exporter, probably a net importer at that point because of that generic flaw. But more generally speaking, you know, given the history of nuclear power development, I think that a systematic and long-term approach where you don't have obviously policy changes every couple of years that throw projects, futures into doubt, that it has to be sustained, that you have to have very strong safety and security standards and maintain them and see them executed. And also don't underestimate the cost and the time it'll take for these projects because there's nothing that's a bigger blow to the image of a technology like nuclear power is for it to continually overpromise and underdeliver. And so I think, those are the sort of mistakes that are being repeated now. And maybe the best model, if we're going to have nuclear power, is going back to a kind of more centralized um, uh, uh, top-down approach where there's at least a more consistent way of evaluating merits and allocating resources in a way to ensure project success rather than just leaving it to the whims of the current kind of chaotic electricity marketplace.
With SMR, it's still not clear whether these will become viable or not, and so the timelines involved are more theoretical from what you explained today. But with a typical light water reactor, what's the typical? I know we haven't built one in a long time, but let's say there was a jurisdiction that was committed, and we have other places in the world where this is taking place. How long from does it take for it to come online typically? And part of my reason for asking, just to see where I'm going, is to bring in the climate crisis sort of element of this conversation, because we have a lot of people talking about how the climate crisis is so dire, we don't have any choice but to turn to nuclear power to be able to do this. And so the timeline, the cost is one thing. Let's say cost wasn't of the problem. Let's say it was just time. How does that work for or against both traditional light water and then speculating on the small modular?
Well, the industry, it's acknowledged that the fact that it's constantly, in the past broke through its original schedules and led to long delays, which do have economic consequences, of course, because of the all the impacts of not meeting your schedule. So that they made it a point to saying that they were going to be doing things differently, and this was originally seen in when the next generation of large light water reactors is developed, and including what's called the AP1000, which is a design which now has only two nuclear reactors in the United States that have started up in the last several decades in Georgia. Westinghouse came up with this design with the promise that it was going to, well, be both cheaper and quicker to build because it had much just smaller infrastructure requirements, less piping, less concrete, less steel, and it was supposedly similar, or it was supposedly easier to build, simpler design, and that wasn't realized. So they blew through their timeline. It was originally only supposed to be 6 years before the reactor was completed and started up. It took more like 12. The cost also ballooned, more than doubled. And this was also seen in European, the few large light water reactors being built in Europe, in Western Europe, for instance, Finland, the UK, and France. So the promise that they were going to do things differently, again, with an eye toward the idea that we don't, we're running out of time and things have to be implemented quickly, if we're going to make a dent in the climate crisis. That wasn't realized with that generation of plants. Now in China, again, not a real expert, they are able to bring things online more quickly, but the magic behind that is something I don't fully understand. At least it seems to be consistent in the West, that you're going to have cost overruns and delays. And so this is what's led to the idea that small modular reactors could be deployed more quickly. But again, the industry, it just moves slowly, and it should, especially if you're developing a new reactor design. So the kind of promise that nuclear power was going to be readily expandable and scalable on the time scale needed to make a dent in the climate crisis, just there's no reason to believe that that's true. But on the other hand, the industry felt like if they couldn't demonstrate that, then they'd be overtaken by wind, solar, and other batteries and become obsolete. So it still remains to be seen.